We're going to ask Anthony Ferguson to come to the stage. I think he's around here. Take it away, brother.
Thanks,
you.
Sean. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you guys today. My hope is to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's to help equip you guys, but more importantly, my hope is that I would help encourage you guys and give you confidence so that when you stand before God's people in the various capacities that God's entrusted to you, that you would do so with the Old Testament with confidence to say that, thus says the word of the Lord. So the title of this presentation is Listening to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls is a popular name that's given to roughly 1,000 manuscripts that were found in various Judean desert sites. These Judean desert sites, the most popular of which is Qumran, but as Dr. Gentry explained, they're also found in other places such as Masada and Nahal Hever. 225 of these texts have been classified by scholars as biblical. That means, according to these scholars, they think that these preserve biblical texts. Now, these biblical texts are vitally important for at least 4 reasons. First, these manuscripts are ancient. They are some of our oldest manuscripts attesting to the Bible. They date from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD. Second, most of these manuscripts are written in the original language of the Old Testament. The majority are written in Hebrew, but we have several texts from Daniel that are preserved in Aramaic, which is the original language for this portion of the book of Daniel. So because these manuscripts are ancient and written in the original language, that leads us to take seriously points 3 and point 4. Point 3 is that collectively, these texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserve thousands of differences when compared to the Jewish canonical text known as the Masoretic text. Now, the Masoretic text isn't just the Jewish canonical text, but it has been the Christian canonical text since Jerome translated into Latin from an MT-like text in the 3rd and 4th century AD. And in fact, if you go to most of our English translations, such as the ESV, the NIV, the NASB, they'll say in the introduction that they're translating from the Masoretic text, and if they differ, they'll footnote it. So these manuscripts are important because on one hand, they preserve thousands of differences when compared to the Masoretic text. But we can't forget point number 4, that despite the vast number of variants preserved among these manuscripts, several of these texts preserve a high, even very high degree of similarity when you compare them to the Masoretic tradition. So point number 3 is illustrated quite well by Emmanuel Tove's classification of the biblical manuscripts from Qumran. Now, these numbers are slightly different than what Peter Gentry just showed us, but that's because Emmanuel Tove has been developing his framework over time. If you analyze his first categorization of texts all the way to the text, the way he categorizes them now, you'll notice that the non-aligned texts are creeping upward and the Masoretic texts are creeping downward. And this comes from a 2010 publication by Armin Lange called Textual Plurality. And in this classification grid, Emmanuel Tove is classifying 56 texts as MT-like. 5 texts, he says, are close to the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is the Samaritan version of Genesis through Deuteronomy, which is an updated and modernized Masoretic text. 7 texts are close to the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the popular name given to the Greek translation of the Old Testament that began in the 3rd century BC and was finished about 130 BC. And then roughly half of the other texts are classified as non-aligned or independent. So this classification grid, in a sense, gives us a bird's eye view into point number 3. Remember, point number 3 was that the Dead Sea Scrolls are important because collectively they're preserving thousands and thousands of differences when you compare them to the canonical Hebrew text, which is the Masoretic text. So this classification grid gives us a bird's eye view into the textual plurality at Qumran. And yet, point number 4 is also evident at Qumran and the other Judean desert sites. We've already seen that 55 texts are classified as MT-like. Now, the other Judean desert sites, the biblical texts found at Nahal Hever and Masada and the others, are all reflecting not only MT-like texts, but what scholars call proto-MT texts. So Armin Longa says that a proto-MT text is a text that agrees with the MT in 98% of its readings. And every biblical text found at these other Judean desert sites reflect the MT texts. To illustrate the high degree of unity that these texts have with the later Aleppo Codex from 930 and Leningrad from 1008, we'll look at a Leviticus scroll found in Masada. So this is the second Leviticus scroll found in Masada that dates to 10 BC to AD 30, so this is roughly the turn of the era. And it agrees with the MT so closely that it even agrees in two very peculiar readings. So what we see here is that the MT tradition reads here, who. That is the third person personal pronoun in Hebrew, meaning he. And it's also the masculine form of the far demonstrative, that. Leningrad from 1008 reads who, but notice the Leviticus text, it also reads who. Now it's important to note that this form, who, is either an archaic form or it's a scribal error. But notice what's happening. The scribe of this Masada text does not change it. Even though he knows this is either an archaic form or a scribal error, he does not change it. And 1,000 years later, we have that exact form, unchanged in the Masoretic text. What that tells us is 3 seriously important things. First of all, the Masoretic text is translated from an ancient text. Although the fullest and best Masoretic text we have is Leningrad from 1008 AD, we see that it has been copied from an ancient text. Also, we see that this text, this tradition has been copied precisely and conservatively. Because when they've approached something that is an archaic form, they have not updated it. Or if this is a scribal error, they have not corrected it. So when we're looking at Qumran, these texts are important for 4 reasons. On the one hand, they're ancient. Next, they're written in the original languages. Now those 2 points force us to take serious point number 3. There is a level of textual plurality evidenced by this categorization grid. 57 texts are classified as independent. That means they don't agree consistently with the MT, the Samaritan Pentateuch, or the Septuagint. They're classified as independent. So we take that serious, but we also take this point serious, that in the midst of a diversity of texts, there is a stable text that's copied with precision and conservatively for over 1,000 years. So that leads us to 2 questions. The first question is, was there a standard Old Testament text during the Second Temple period? Does point number 3, the fact that we have these texts that are non-aligned, are independent, indicate textual chaos, as Peter Gentry labeled it? And next, the next question is, did the Old Testament text move from textual plurality to unity, or did an authoritative text exist alongside of a diversity of texts? So those are the 2 questions we'll address in this presentation. It is my contention that although many scholars understand the Old Testament text to have moved from a diversity of texts, point number 3, to a unity, point number 4, it is my contention that an abundance of evidence suggests that there has always been a standard Old Testament text that has existed alongside a diversity of texts. So the evidence, we will cover 2 pieces of evidence in this presentation. First, most of the differences that are preserved in these non-aligned texts derive from common scribal practices. These differences are common tendencies such as poor copying, such as parablepsis like we saw in 1Q Isaiah A. Or perhaps there's a similar sounding letter or a letter that looks similar. Scribal error accounts for many differences. Another common scribal tendency is interpretation. A scribe doesn't want you to misunderstand a text, so he interprets it. These two scribal tendencies and a few others account for the vast majority of this quote-unquote textual plurality. And secondly, there's other Second Temple literature that attests to a standard Old Testament text during the Second Temple period. So when we're looking at these non-aligned texts, these independent texts that are supposed to demonstrate for us textual plurality, textual chaos, what I'm arguing for is that these are scribal innovations. So we'll look at 4 texts. The first one is 4Q Genesis K. This is a Genesis manuscript found in the 4th cave of Qumran, and I'm calling this a normalized text. Now this text is poorly preserved, and yet what is preserved, there are 3 variants when we compare it to the Masoretic text, and they're all listed up there for you. But when we look at these variants, we see that there is a common denominator unifying these variants. The first variant is found at Genesis 1:9. When we look at the MT, this is called a jussive. It's a tense of volition. Let it appear. But when we look at this form, we realize this is not the common way Hebrew does the jussive. This is called a third yod vav verb, and this verb, when it's in a jussive, it chops off that final letter. Now, when we come over to the Genesis text, notice that that letter is gone. This text has taken an acceptable form in the Masoretic text, but an uncommon form, and it has updated it to fit the normal biblical Hebrew way of doing the jussive. Now, when we look at the next verse, this is from Genesis 1:14, where God says that the stars and the sun and the moon will be for seasons, will be for signs, and then for seasons, and then for days and years. But notice in the MT text, there is no preposition attached to the noun years. It just says and years. Now, in Hebrew, you can do this construction of one in 2 ways. If you have a preposition that governs multiple nouns, you could say 4 seasons, 4 signs, 4 days, and 4 years. But you don't have to do it that way. You could say for signs, for seasons, for days, and years. And that's the same thing we do in English. I could say I went to Home Depot and Aldi. I don't have to say I went to Home Depot and to Aldi. The preposition in English can govern more than one noun, and it's the same way in Hebrew. But notice that the common way to do this is by repeating the preposition, the form of 4Q Genesis K. So again, we have in the MT an acceptable way to do this clause, but it's uncommon. And what has this Genesis text done? It has updated the text to give us the more common form. Now, when we look at Genesis 3:1, this is the verse where the serpent comes and tempts Eve. We'll notice that, again, there's a difference between these manuscripts. In this manuscript, the Qumran manuscript, it has an interrogative particle. This little letter is called the hey, and it indicates that this is a question. But notice that the MT doesn't have that interrogative hey. Again, in biblical Hebrew, you can indicate a question in a few ways. One is by means of intonation. Another way is by indicating it by means of this particle. We do the same thing in English. I could say, do you like avocados? I'm from California. Or I could say, you like avocados? Either way indicates a question. On the one hand, I used an auxiliary verb do to indicate the question. On the other hand, I signaled the question simply by intonation. Now, it's clear that both of these verses are questions. That's evident based on context. And when the reader would read the text in the synagogue, he would signal the question by means of intonation. But again, notice that in biblical Hebrew, the more common way to signal a question is by means of an interrogative particle. So what have we seen with 4Q Genesis K? Remember, this is the textual plurality. This is the textual chaos we just got done learning about. What is the nature of this textual chaos? Well, when it comes to 4Q Genesis K, it's a normalized chaos. It's a normalized manuscript. What this scribe has done is he's taken uncommon but acceptable forms in the Masoretic text, and he's given you the more common form. 4Q Genesis K. Now we have 4Q Deuteronomy N. Peter Gentry talked about this in some detail, and it wasn't intentional for me to talk about it as well, but this is an excerpted text like we learned from Dr. Gentry's presentation. And this text preserves Deuteronomy 8, 5 through 10 as a historical prologue. And then we have Deuteronomy 5, and then in the last column we have a few lines that record for us Deuteronomy 6, 1, but the rest has deteriorated. So what we see in this manuscript is the text has been rearranged. We have Deuteronomy 8 preceding Deuteronomy 5, and we have a conflation. We have both reasons for the Sabbath day combined in this text. Now, there was never a form of Deuteronomy that had Deuteronomy 8 preceding Deuteronomy 5. Let's make that clear. This is an excerpted text. Now, excerption is a common practice in antiquity. We even see it in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy, where God says to the people that they're supposed to put the word of God on their foreheads and on the doorposts of their home. They're not supposed to put the entire Torah or Old Testament on their doorposts. They're supposed to put a portion of the scripture on their doorposts. These are called phylacteries and mezuzot in Jewish tradition. So excerpting is a common practice in antiquity, and we find it throughout Judaism. In fact, the Talmud talks a lot about how to excerpt these texts properly, that you can use certain types of hide for excerpted text but not for biblical text, certain types of ink for excerpted text and other types for biblical text. It gives lots of rules. So excerpted text is very common in Judaism, and that's exactly what this is. How do we know? Here are 3 reasons. First of all, 4Q Deuteronomy N is small. Its column height is 3 inches tall. Now, when you make a biblical manuscript, when you make a manuscript from leather, the height of the column has to be proportionate to the length of the manuscript. Imagine having a manuscript that was 3 inches tall and 30 feet long. How cumbersome of a manuscript would that be? It would be this tall and this wide, and you would be holding it around. There would be no place to store it, and it would be incredibly brittle. So when we look at manuscripts in Judaism, we learn that the column height is always proportionate to the length. So what does that tell us about this text? It was 3 inches tall. It never, ever contained the entire book of Deuteronomy. Second, Deuteronomy 5 is found in this passage, and that is a very common text that is found in excerpted texts. And then the text is rearranged. And by definition, that's what excerpted texts do. They rearrange the biblical text. So for these 3 reasons, there's every reason to think that this was not an alternative addition of Deuteronomy, as if Deuteronomy existed in a form where Deuteronomy 8 preceded Deuteronomy 5. Rather, this is either a liturgical text, a text that a guy used to read in the synagogue, or this is a private devotion text, or this is a text for pedagogy. Maybe he just wanted to teach his children that both reasons for celebrating the Sabbath day, and make sure that he emphasized the reason, the historical prologue for the 10 Commandments. For whatever reason, it is clear this is an excerpted text. Now, we excerpt texts all the time. We have lectionaries, so if you're a part of certain church traditions, you have lots of Bible readings in the church service, and these lectionaries are excerpted texts. Also, probably some of you own what do Proverbs have to say about money? What do the Proverbs have to say about laziness? And what are these books about? They take all of the Proverbs that are about one particular theme, and they put them together in a book. That's an excerpted text. Or if you were just to do a Google search, my trackpad on my Mac was acting up, so I'm praying to God it was cheap. So I can't do it here, but I hope it's cheap to fix the trackpad is what I was trying to say. But if I had my Mac, imagine I had my MacBook Pro right here, and because it's Mac, it shouldn't act up. Shame on you, Mac. And I'm typing in, and I do a Google search of Proverbs about money. What's going to happen? So I'm going to pull up a Google page that is going to have all of the Proverbs that have to do with money. That is an excerpted Google page. So we excerpt text all the time. So again, when we're thinking about point 3, textual plurality, those texts that are supposed to demonstrate a fluid text, we've learned that some of this fluidity is just scribes making the text normal, making the text fit normal biblical grammatical constructions. We've now also learned that some of this fluidity is because people excerpted their texts, and that's exactly what we do. So let's also make it clear that this is not a biblical text in the strictest sense. Nobody looked at this and thought this was a biblical text. They always knew it was an excerpted text. And yet scholars classify this as biblical. Now let's go to 4Q Psalm X. This is perhaps the oldest manuscript we have preserving a psalm. This is preserving, quote unquote, Psalm 89, and it could date to 175 BC, and yet it is a poorly copied manuscript. In fact, what this text seems to be is a scribal schoolboy's homework assignment, not trying to be pedantic. So let's look at 11 reasons why this text is poorly copied. First of all, some letters are smaller than others. Look how much smaller this mem, that's the letter M, is than this mem. This one is much smaller than that one. Notice also that the scribe seems to be subject to Aramaic influence. We have this form right here, which some scholars want to say is an archaic form, but rather just seems to be an Aramaic form of the 1CS perfect. We also have a letter that's reshaped from a possible yod to a resh. So he wrote the wrong letter, he realized it, and he's kind of highlighted over it so that you realize that this is a resh, not a yod. We see that the scribe is also inconsistent in final letters. Some letters in Hebrew look different when they're at the end of a word. And if a scribe is inconsistent in doing this, the Talmud says that's a vulgar text. That's what it calls them. And notice that that's exactly what this scribe is doing. Notice, where's my pointer? It's out of batteries. Okay. There you go. Spiritual warfare. We won't let that happen. All right. I can't believe that. My goodness, my MacBook Pro trackpad gets silly, and now my pointer. All right, let's. You need more than 2? No, just 2, Dr. Gentry. Thank you. All right, it's buzzing. Hopefully that's a good sign. All right. Okay, and I had a help from somebody, Dr. Dempster. Okay, so I mentioned that this mem should look different at the end of the word. Here's a final mem, and that letter should look like that, but it doesn't. That's a no-no. And then we have point number 5. Some words are written higher on the line than others. Notice that this text is written, this word is written much higher on the line than these 2 words. Point number 6, we see that the scribe does not leave enough space between 2 words that are preserved on line 3. There should be a space right. Here's the preposition mem on a noun, shemin, meaning to anoint, or oil. And so there should be a space right here, and there is no space. And then we see cancellation dots. We saw this in 1Q Isaiah A, but this scribe makes a mistake, and he has to cancel this word with cancellation dots. We see that at the end of a line, the scribe has not spaced his words properly. So what does he do? He runs out of room, and he has to crowd his mem really, really close to this noon. So he's running out of space. He's not able to space his words properly. Point number 9, the scribe at times runs out of room at the end of the line, so he doesn't have enough room to squeeze things in. He has to write the rest of the word above the line. And this happens on multiple lines. Notice the tav here, what seems to be a yod here, a portion of a noon here. And notice this gimel here, the letter G, that's written in between lines. This scribe consistently runs out of room at the end of the line, so he either makes it fit or he writes above the line or in between the line. And notice number 11, the lines are not always straight. Here is an example par excellence right here. you see that there may be some shrinkage right here, but not enough to compensate for this kind of trajectory. He starts going upward and then downward. We see a similar thing here. Look how high up he's going here. So he's not writing straight at all. And I think I missed a point, but my one point that's somewhere in these 11 is that notice the space between lines is not consistent. Now that's normal. Lines aren't always evenly spaced, but notice the degree of differences we have between this line and then say lines 3 and 4. It's drastic. And then notice 1, 2, 3, 4. Between lines 5 and 6, notice how much space we have between these lines. So what we're seeing is that this text has been poorly copied. It's just by happenstance that it's been reserved for us, that it's been preserved for us. This is a poorly copied manuscript. Now when we compare this text, so here's 4Q Psalm X, and we compare it to 4Q Deuteronomy N, we can compare the quality of inscription. Notice that this text is ruled. You can see faintly horizontal rulings in the text, and you can also see faintly vertical rulings on either side. The horizontal rulings make sure that you are writing straight, and the vertical rulings make sure you don't write into the margin. What that does is that's create what's called a writing block. This is a very, very nice writing block, and a lot could be said about why it ends right here and doesn't fill in the rest, but we'll have to save that for a different time. But notice over here, there is no horizontal ruling. There is no vertical ruling. And and the lack of ruling is partly to blame on why this text is so wild, why the guy can't space his words properly, why he has to write things above the line. The text is not ruled. But notice also something else important. Notice these holes right here. These are stitching holes. And notice what the scribe has done. If that hole was not there, he could have written that mim right over that hole. Same thing with this T sound. He wrote it above the line. This text was written after it was stitched. Now that's important because the process of taking a piece of cow and taking it to be a manuscript is extensive. You have to roll it. You have to put it out in the sun. You have to put solutions on it to take off the hair. There's a lot to do. Then you have to cut it. But what is done typically with manuscripts is that you rule it, and then you inscribe it, and finally you stitch it. So why was this stitched before it was written? The argument is, and I think it's persuasive, is that this was a recycled handle sheet. Now a handle sheet a handle sheet is a piece of leather that's put at the beginning of a manuscript in order to protect the manuscript. And this piece of leather is not ruled, or at least we don't think it's ruled, and it's not ruled, and it's not inscribed. So the fact that this is not ruled and it was stitched before inscription strongly suggests that this is a recycled handle sheet. Now, why would a scribe do that? Because leather's expensive. Leather's very, very expensive. Dr. Gentry would say that in class. So you recycle your leather. So what the scribe has done is he's taken an old manuscript and he's taken the handle sheet off to do his homework. And that's what we have. This textual plurality, that's point number 3, that is indicative of an Old Testament text that is not stable or authoritative according to many scholars. They're alluding to a plurality that derives from poor copying. They're alluding to a diversity that in reality this is a scribal schoolboy's exercise. So when we're looking at this textual plurality, point number 3, we have to take it serious because these are old and they're written in the original languages. But we've seen that some of this plurality is just trying to normalize the text. That was 4Q Genesis K. We've also learned that some of this plurality is simply because the texts are excerpted. They're not even biblical texts. And what we learn here is that some of this plurality is because of poor copying. Now, the last text we'll cover today is 4Q Koheleth A. This is a manuscript of Ecclesiastes found in the 4th cave. And this is a modernized text. Now, interestingly, this is one of our oldest Dead Sea Scrolls. It dates perhaps to 180 BC. But notice that it is it preserves a late grammatical profile. We see that there are two variants between 4Q Koheleth and the MT that demonstrate a late grammatical profile. So if you were to do a relative clause in Hebrew, you can do it in a few ways. One is you could do this pronoun, an asher clause, and this would introduce a relative clause. Or you could just do the particle sheen, and this letter alone would indicate a relative clause. Now, both of these ways of indicating a relative clause coexisted in Hebrew together. You could do it either way, but this form was reserved mainly for the vernacular, for the spoken language, and this was found mostly in books, in the literature. But when you get to the exile, this form begins to skyrocket so that when you get to the Mishnah, which is the codification of the oral law in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, you only have this form. I think there are 8 forms of asher, and they're all quotations of a biblical text. This form is not found in the Mishnah besides quoting the biblical text. So what we're seeing here is that although this is one of our oldest texts we have from the 2nd century BC, I'm getting excited. Don't listen to what I'm saying. From the 2nd century BC, and Leningrad is from 1008 AD, 1,200 years later, Leningrad is preserving an earlier grammatical profile. We see the same thing happening with the linguistic profile. 4Q Koheleth A is subject to Aramaic influence. So, Jews before the exile didn't know Aramaic, because remember when the Assyrians are coming to attack Hezekiah, they go to the general and they say, "Hey, don't talk to us in Aramaic. Don't talk to us in Hebrew. Talk to us in Aramaic so that people don't understand." So they don't know Aramaic beforehand, but afterwards they're bilingual. They know Aramaic and Hebrew. So what's happening here is we have this scribe who his Aramaic, perhaps even mother tongue, is causing him to go astray. So when you have forms in Hebrew that are similar to the form in Aramaic, that becomes tripping ground for a scribe who knows Aramaic. Because it's very easy for him to say, well, that sounds like Aramaic, and either to make an intentional error or an unintentional error. So these are 3 examples of possible Aramaic influence, which indicates for us that this text, although one of our oldest ones, is preserving for us a late linguistic profile, later than Leningrad. We see the same thing happening with the spelling profile. So in Hebrew, originally only consonants were written. Vowels were not written. And even, like Dr. Gentry said, you read a modern Hebrew newspaper or see a modern Hebrew stop sign, there are no vowels. But everybody knows what to do. If they didn't, they would put the vowels in the stop sign, right? The Jews can import the vowels based on context. So early on, there were no vowels, only consonants. But as Hebrew began to progress, vowels were indicated by means of a few consonants, but only at the end of a word. And as Hebrew continued to progress, those consonants would represent vowels at the end of a word and in the middle of the word, until you get to Qumran, which loves to mark vowels by means of these consonants. They love especially to mark the O sound. And in biblical Hebrew, you mark the O sound with a consonant only when it's a long O. But in Qumran Hebrew, you mark it for any kind of O. You even mark it for a schwa, which is like the, T-H-E. E in the is a schwa. That's not much of a vowel at all. But in Qumran, sometimes they mark it with a vowel. They love using these things. But notice that 4Q Koheleth A, notice that this letter is a consonant representing a vowel here, and this aleph here as well. What we're seeing here is that 4Q Koheleth A, although it's one of our oldest manuscripts, preserves for us a late grammatical profile, late linguistic profile, and a late spelling profile. And Leningrad, although 1,200 years later, is preserving for us an earlier form of the text. So when we're looking at this textual plurality, we have to ask the question, well, what's the nature of this plurality? And I wrote my dissertation on this, and there's 55 manuscripts. I looked at over 600 pages, so I couldn't possibly have covered that in in 40, and Dr. Mead was trying to cut my time even more at the beginning of this lecture. But there's 4 for you. So this textual plurality, some of its results from scribes trying to normalize the text. Some of the diversity derives from excerpting the text. Some derives from poor copying, and other derives from updating the text. There are other differences as well, but we don't have time to cover them. Now, so that was the first point. A standard text has always existed. How do we know? Let's investigate the nature of these differences. They derive from common scribal tendencies, and I just showed you that. My next piece of evidence is that there is direct evidence that discusses a stable text during the Second Temple period. You know, these people who hold to this textual chaos, they don't like Josephus and what he says here. Because what he says is that no one has added or omitted a word from Judaism's 22-book canon. Now, I just showed you a lot of manuscripts that add and omit. So what's Josephus referring to? He's not referring to the text in the desert. He's referring to the temple text. Josephus is a mainline Jew. He's a general in the army who has a priestly background. He is referring to the temple text. And then when Jesus makes the comment in Matthew 5:18 that not even the smallest detail of the word of God passes away. What these liberal scholars want to tell you is that Jesus was wrong. He was just adopting a vogue new idea about the stability of the text. But that was wrong. That's what they say. But what Jesus is clearly indicating with Josephus is that there is a stable, authoritative Old Testament text. So there is direct evidence that talks about this issue. But now there's also a plethora of circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of evidence in Second Temple literary documents that assume that there has always been a standard Old Testament text. The first piece of evidence is the need for new Greek texts. Immediately after the Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century BC, at least the Torah, it began immediately to be revised. We see this in the Greek Minor Prophet Scroll found in Nahal Hever, and we see it with the 3 main revisers. This is a common thing happening even before the turn of the era. And guess what's happening? These scribes are taking their Septuagint and they're correcting it to fit an MT-like text. Every single revision functions to correct a Septuagint-based text to align more closely with a Masoretic text. Why are they doing that? Because they understand that in the midst of the diversity, there is a stable text, and it is a text very close to the MT text. Next, we see that there is a need for new translations. This is seen in the letter of Aristeas. So the letter of Aristeas is a document that dates to the 2nd century BC, and scholars doubt the historicity of a lot of what it says, and some probably for good reason. And yet, there is historical truth in this letter. Namely, what this author is trying to do is he's trying to persuade his audience that, hey, there is a Greek authoritative text that I have that you can trust. So in order for him to convince his audience that you can trust the Greek text he has to give them evidence that they see as persuasive. He has to tap into a shared knowledge bank and appeal to it in order to be persuasive. Now, he gives several pieces of evidence on why you should trust his text, but one piece of evidence is that his text has been copied from a deluxe text from the temple guarded by the proper authority. So whether or not the text was copied from that text or not is beside the point. It probably wasn't. But what we know is that in order for him to give that reason, it's telling us that in the 2nd century BC, Jews knew that the best text was in the temple. And if you have a text from the temple, if you have 2 texts, one out in Egypt and one from the temple, and you find one in the temple, you correct to that text. So the need for new Greek translations indicates it's circumstantial evidence, but it assumes a stable Old Testament text. We also see some scribal intervention in the MT tradition. So there are several examples of this, but one is what's called the inverted nunim. So these are the letter nun that's used as a scribal sign to either indicate that these verses are out of place or, according to rabbinic tradition, that these verses indicate a book on their own right. The point is, though, that these nuns are adopted from Alexandrian scribal practices that date perhaps as early as the 3rd century BC. Now, this is the point. Here we have people copying the MT tradition that instead of changing the text, use a scribal sign. And then those who copy the text, instead of saying, oh, inverted nuns, let's just change the text, they don't do that. Instead, they copy the text exactly where it's at and the signs. What that indicates is that perhaps as early as the 3rd century BC or 2nd century BC, we have people in the MT tradition that see their consonants as sacred. They won't change it. They'll indicate a sign that perhaps this is wrong, but they will not change it. We see the same thing with the Ketiv Kare. So the Ketiv Kare is a scribal phenomenon that means something is written, but something else is read. So Ketiv is Aramaic for what is written, Kare is Aramaic for what is read. So what you would have is you'd have a form that is written, and then you would have a separate reading tradition about how to read this text in the synagogue. What's important to note is that the scribes copying this tradition, they would not change the Ketiv. Rather, what they would do is they would put the Kare in the marginal note or just maintain it in the reading tradition. So if we go all the way back to that 4Q Leviticus text, that Masada Leviticus text, that reading who, that is the Ketiv. And it's corrected in the MT text only with the vowel. But my point is simply that the Ketiv Kare phenomenon indicates that even when a scribe thinks a form is wrong or archaic, he won't change the text. Why? Because the text is sacred. We also see that there is a willingness to die for the Old Testament. So when we look at the 2nd century BC, we see, especially when we read the book, the Maccabees, we learn about Antiochus Epiphanes' Hellenization efforts. If you were a Jew in the 2nd century BC, you couldn't practice circumcision, couldn't celebrate the Sabbath, you couldn't read the Torah. If you did, you would die. So Jews were faced with either compromising on their religion, dying, or rebelling. Well, a lot of Jews died. Josephus talks about these, as does Maccabees. Would they be willing to die for a text that they thought was fluid? Absolutely not. They're dying for a religion that is prescribed in a stable text. Again, circumstantial evidence, but the willingness to die assumes a stable text. We also see that Jews think they can obey the law. Well, if the law is fluid, you can't obey it. But Jews think they can obey it. Josephus says that the Pharisees obeyed the law precisely. When Jesus is arguing with the Jews, he says, or when he's arguing with the Pharisees, he says, you obey the little parts of the law, but you relax the big parts of the law, when he's referring to Corban. And when we look at the Qumran community in their handbook, if a person disobeyed the law of God, they would be strictly punished. And the interpreter of the law, the leader of this community, his rule was to instruct the people so that they obeyed the law precisely. If the text was fluid, would they be able to do that? Again, circumstantial evidence, but the thought that they can obey the law precisely assumes a stable text. Also, the organization of the Qumran community. Dr. Gentry said this in our historical Hebrew grammar class at least 5 years ago. But when you look at the organization of the Qumran community, what we learn is that the leader of this community, his job is to teach the people Moses and the prophets. So notice that he's not on the same level as Moses and the prophets. He may be inspired, but what he's inspired to do is to give the proper interpretation of Moses and the prophets. So in the organization of the Qumran community, in the fact that the leader, his purpose is to teach the people of God, Moses and the prophets, again assumes a stable Old Testament text. And finally, we're privy to some Second Temple Jewish debates. In the New Testament, you see Jesus debating often with the Pharisees. But notice something important. Jesus never debates the words of the Old Testament. He's always debating the proper interpretation of the Old Testament. We're also privy to a manuscript in Qumran that's actually a dialogue between, or it's a discussion between the leader of the Qumran community and the leader of the temple. And what we're seeing in this text is that they're debating the proper interpretation of the law. They're not debating the words of the law. So again, what we're seeing is that, yes, this is circumstantial evidence, but what all this evidence is doing is that it's assuming a stable Old Testament text. And it's my contention that when you listen to Qumran in its proper context, and you listen to the nature of the textual chaos, and you look to the direct evidence from Josephus and Jesus, while listening to the circumstantial evidence that we just got done reviewing, what this all indicates is that there has always been a standard Old Testament text that has existed in the midst of a diversity of texts. And that text is very close to the Masoretic text. So I have complete conviction. I'm the senior pastor of a church in Upland, California, 11th Street Baptist Church. I have complete conviction that when I'm preached through Genesis like I'm doing right now, I stand before the people of God with my English Bible and I say with confidence, "Thus says the word of the Lord." You should do likewise.